When Ukrainian intelligence analysts began reviewing reconnaissance drone footage captured over Russian positions near Bakhmut during the first week of November 2025, they noticed something that initially seemed like equipment malfunction. The drone's thermal sensors, which normally detect heat signatures from vehicles, equipment, and personnel with perfect clarity even in complete darkness, were showing areas where significant military activity should be present, but where thermal signatures were strangely weak or entirely absent. In some shots, you could clearly see armored vehicles in the visual spectrum, but when switching to thermal imaging, those same vehicles practically vanished, displaying temperatures barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Analysts initially assumed electronic interference was affecting the sensors, or that atmospheric conditions were creating anomalies in thermal readings. But when the same pattern appeared in footage from multiple different drones, operating at different times of day and using different types of thermal sensors from various manufacturers, it became clear they weren't dealing with a technical glitch, but something entirely new. Russia had deployed some kind of advanced thermal camouflage technology that was rendering their vehicles and positions effectively invisible to one of the most critical detection systems in modern warfare. And in the last 10 days, since this technology first appeared on the battlefield, it has fundamentally altered the dynamics of how fighting is conducted across multiple frontline sectors, frustrating Ukrainian attacks that relied on thermal detection, allowing Russian forces to position themselves undetected, and forcing a complete reevaluation of tactics that had been effective for the past 2 years. Let me explain exactly what this technology is, how it works, why it's so effective, and most importantly, what it means for the future of warfare when one of the most reliable methods for detecting enemies, thermal imaging, suddenly becomes unreliable. The technology that defies physics. Thermal imaging has been one of the most revolutionary technologies in modern warfare over the past 4 decades. The principle is simple. All objects emit infrared radiation based on their temperature. Hotter objects emit more infrared radiation than cooler ones. Thermal cameras detect this radiation and create images where different temperatures appear as different colors or shades of gray. This allows soldiers to see in complete darkness through smoke, fog, and many types of visual camouflage that work against normal vision, but are useless against thermal detection. Military vehicles are particularly easy to spot with thermal imaging because they generate significant heat. Engines running at 80 to 100 degrees Celsius, exhaust systems emitting gases at several hundred degrees, even electrical systems and mechanical friction generate heat. An operating tank typically has a thermal signature 30 to 50 degrees Celsius hotter than the surrounding environment, making it glow like a beacon in thermal imaging, even from several kilometers away. Throughout this war, both sides have relied heavily on thermal imaging. Drones use thermal cameras to detect enemy vehicles and positions at night. Weapon systems use thermal sensors for target acquisition. Soldiers use handheld thermal vision devices to spot threats. The ability to see the enemy when they can't see you has been a decisive tactical advantage in countless engagements. What Russia has deployed is a system that Western analysts are provisionally calling Nikita-M, an advanced version of thermal camouflage technology Russia has been developing for over a decade, but which has apparently seen significant breakthroughs in the last 2 years. The system consists of a specialized cover made from multiple layers of advanced materials that is installed over armored vehicles, covering all surfaces that would normally emit detectable thermal signatures. The outer layer is made of a rugged fabric designed to withstand combat conditions. Tear-resistant, somewhat fragmentation-resistant, and treated to resist fire and chemicals. Beneath this are multiple layers of insulating materials that block heat transfer from the vehicle to the outside. But the real innovation is in the inner layers. An active thermal management system that uses a network of thin tubes carrying coolant fluid, low-power electric pumps, and a computerized control system that constantly monitors the outer surface temperature of the cover. Here's how it works. Heat generated by the vehicle's engine and other systems would normally radiate outward, creating a bright thermal signature. Instead, the insulation traps most of that heat. Any heat that does make it through the insulation is detected by temperature sensors on the inner surface of the cover. The control system activates pumps that circulate coolant fluid through the tubes in those areas, absorbing the heat and transporting it to a heat exchanger that dissipates it gradually in a controlled manner, typically through areas that are naturally warmer or where heat emission won't create a distinctive signature. The result is that the outer surface temperature of the cover is kept very close to ambient temperature, typically within 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. In thermal imaging, the vehicle appears roughly the same temperature as the surrounding terrain, making it extremely difficult to detect. It's not perfect invisibility. If you know exactly where to look and use very high-resolution thermal equipment, you can still pick up subtle anomalies, but it's effective enough to dramatically degrade the performance of the thermal detection systems Ukraine has been using. The system requires electrical power to run the pumps and control system, about 500 to 800 watts of continuous power, which is supplied by the vehicle's electrical system. This means the thermal camouflage only works when the vehicle is operating and generating electricity. A powered-down vehicle will eventually cool to ambient temperature anyway, so active camouflage isn't needed. But for vehicles that are running, moving, or idling with engines on, the system can reduce the thermal signature by about 80 to 90% compared to an unprotected vehicle. The deployment that changed the game. The first confirmed reports of Russian vehicles equipped with this advanced thermal camouflage system came on October 28, 2025, 8 days ago. A Ukrainian unit operating near Bakhmut had planned a nighttime attack on a Russian position that intelligence had identified as containing several armored vehicles. The plan was to use drones with thermal cameras to precisely locate the vehicles, then hit them with guided artillery and attack drones. When reconnaissance drones flew over the target area at night, operators expected to see the characteristic bright thermal signatures of armored vehicles. Instead, they saw very little. There were some weak thermal anomalies that might have been vehicles, but the signatures were so faint that operators weren't sure. Thinking the vehicles might have been moved or that intelligence was wrong, the Ukrainian unit decided to postpone the attack. The next morning, when daylight allowed visual reconnaissance, drones confirmed the Russian vehicles were definitely there, exactly where they were supposed to be. There were at least 6 armored vehicles, including what appeared to be T-90 tanks and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, all covered with what looked like unusual camouflage tarps or covers. When drones switched back to thermal imaging during the day, with the vehicles clearly visible in visual footage, the thermal signatures were still surprisingly weak. This pattern repeated in multiple locations over the following days. Ukrainian units that had relied on thermal imaging to detect and strike Russian vehicles at night suddenly found their thermal sensors far less effective. Vehicles that should have been obvious in thermal imaging were barely visible or completely invisible. Attacks that would have been executed with confidence based on thermal detection now required visual confirmation, which was only possible during the day, and exposed reconnaissance drones to greater risk of being shot down by Russian air defenses. By November 3rd, Ukrainian intelligence had confirmed that Russia had deployed this thermal camouflage system in at least 3 different frontline sectors, near Bakhmut, near Avdiivka, and in the Zaporizhzhia region. The exact number of equipped vehicles is unclear. Estimates range from about 50 to possibly over 200. But it's clear this is not a limited experiment, but a significant operational deployment. Analysts believe Russia has likely been producing this system for several months and stockpiling an inventory before deploying it on the battlefield. The timing of the deployment, in late October when nights are getting longer and nighttime operations become more critical, is probably no coincidence. Russia is trying to exploit the advantage of this technology during the period when it will be most effective. The impact. No one anticipated. The tactical impact of thermal camouflage has been significant in the areas where it has been deployed. Ukrainian units have had to rapidly adjust their tactics, adapting to the reality that a detection method they had relied on for 2 years is suddenly far less reliable. The most obvious change is that nighttime operations have become more difficult and riskier. Previously, Ukrainian units could use drones with thermal cameras to map Russian positions at night with high confidence, identifying vehicle locations, weapon positions, and troop concentrations. Now, when operating in areas where they know Russia has deployed thermal camouflage, they can't trust they're seeing the full picture. There may be vehicles or positions that simply don't show up in thermal imaging. This has forced greater reliance on daytime visual reconnaissance, but daytime recon has significant drawbacks. Drones are easier to spot and shoot down during the day. Visual reconnaissance is more easily fooled by traditional camouflage, netting, decoys, and it requires clear weather conditions, whereas thermal imaging works through fog, rain, and smoke. Drone strikes have also become more complicated. Many Ukrainian attack drones use thermal sensors for final target acquisition during the strike. An operator flies the drone to the target area using GPS navigation and visual references, then switches to thermal imaging to identify and hit the specific target. If the target doesn't show up clearly in thermal, the operator has to rely on visual imaging, which is less effective in low light, smoke, or bad weather. There have been several documented cases in the last 8 days where Ukrainian drone attacks failed because operators couldn't acquire targets using thermal sensors. In one case on October 30th, a Ukrainian attack drone was sent to destroy a Russian tank that had been identified via daytime visual reconnaissance. When the drone reached the target area after dark, the operator couldn't locate the tank using thermal imaging. The tank was there, confirmed by later reconnaissance, but its thermal signature was so weak, the operator couldn't distinguish it from the surrounding terrain. The drone eventually ran out of fuel and had to return without attacking. Russia has also used thermal camouflage for more aggressive tactics. There have been reports of Russian armored vehicles equipped with the system moving at night to positions closer to Ukrainian lines, taking advantage of the reduced detection risk. In one case on November 2nd, several Russian armored vehicles moved during the night to positions less than 2 kilometers from Ukrainian lines, much closer than they would normally attempt because the risk of detection by thermal drones would have been too high. The next morning, those vehicles provided fire support for a Russian infantry assault that partially caught Ukrainian forces by surprise because they hadn't detected the vehicle repositioning overnight. The countermeasures being developed. Ukrainian forces aren't simply accepting this new reality passively. They're actively working on countermeasures and adapted tactics to mitigate the effectiveness of Russian thermal camouflage. The most obvious countermeasure is to improve other detection methods that don't rely on thermal imaging. Radar can detect vehicles based on radio wave reflection rather than heat emissions, and isn't affected by thermal camouflage. Ukraine is deploying more ground surveillance radars in areas where Russian thermal camouflage is prevalent. These radars can detect vehicle movement even when the vehicles are thermally camouflaged. Acoustic sensors are also effective. Armored vehicles generate significant noise from engines, tracks, and mechanical systems. Networks of acoustic sensors can detect and locate vehicles based on sound signatures. Ukraine is expanding the use of acoustic sensors, particularly in areas where thermal camouflage has degraded thermal detection effectiveness. There are also efforts to improve thermal imaging itself. Russian thermal camouflage reduces thermal signatures but doesn't eliminate them entirely. With higher resolution thermal cameras and more sophisticated image processing algorithms, it's possible to detect the subtle thermal anomalies that camouflaged vehicles still produce. Ukraine is working with Western partners to obtain more advanced thermal imaging equipment and develop software that can identify thermally camouflaged vehicles based on subtle patterns. Another approach is to attack the camouflage system itself. Active thermal camouflage requires electrical power to operate. If the vehicle's electrical system is damaged, the camouflage stops working. The camouflage covers are also vulnerable to fragmentation or fire damage. An attack that doesn't destroy the vehicle but damages the camouflage cover can make the vehicle thermally detectable again. Ukraine is adjusting tactics to include suppression attacks designed to damage camouflage systems, even if they don't immediately destroy the vehicles. There are also intelligence efforts to better understand the Russian system, how it works, what its limitations are, how it can be defeated. Ukraine is trying to capture intact examples of the camouflage system, either by recovering covers from destroyed Russian vehicles or capturing intact vehicles. Detailed analysis of the technology could reveal vulnerabilities that can be exploited. The implications that extend beyond this conflict. But beyond the immediate tactical impact in this specific conflict, Russia's deployment of advanced thermal camouflage represents a significant development in the ongoing arms race between detection and concealment that has defined warfare for centuries. For decades, thermal imaging has been seen as one of the most reliable detection technologies, something extremely difficult to fool. Militaries around the world have invested heavily in thermal imaging capabilities, assuming they would provide a decisive advantage in detecting enemies. If effective thermal camouflage becomes widely available, that advantage is significantly eroded. This doesn't mean thermal imaging becomes useless. Even with thermal camouflage, vehicles still produce some thermal signatures, And with sensitive enough equipment and sophisticated algorithms, those signatures can be detected. But it means thermal imaging is no longer the magic solution it once was. You can no longer just point a thermal camera and expect to see everything that's there. This will likely accelerate the development of multi-sensor detection systems that combine thermal imaging with radar, acoustic sensors, visual imaging, and other modalities. Instead of relying on a single type of sensor, future systems will use multiple sensors simultaneously, fusing the data to create a more complete picture. If a vehicle is hard to see thermally but still visible on radar, or if it's thermally camouflaged but still generates acoustic noise, the sensor combination can still detect it. We'll also likely see more development of camouflage technologies, not just thermal camouflage but radar camouflage, acoustic camouflage, and advanced visual camouflage. The race between detection and concealment will continue, with each side developing more sophisticated technologies to overcome the other's capabilities. For militaries watching this conflict and learning lessons, the message is clear. You can't rely on any single detection method. Technologies that seem to provide decisive advantage today can be countered tomorrow. Adaptability, the ability to rapidly shift tactics and technologies when the enemy develops countermeasures, is more important than any specific weapon system or sensor. And as Ukrainian analysts continue reviewing drone footage, searching for the faint thermal signatures of Russian vehicles that should be bright, but are instead barely visible, as engineers work on countermeasures and commanders adjust tactics, the fundamental lesson is that in modern warfare, no advantage is permanent, and constant innovation is the only way to stay ahead. If you were fascinated to discover how a new thermal camouflage technology is fundamentally changing the effectiveness of one of the most reliable detection systems in modern warfare, and you want to keep exploring the technological innovations that are redefining combat in real time, subscribe to the channel because there are dozens of these emerging technologies right now that will change how wars are fought in the coming decades.